Welcome to Week 5 of Understanding Islam, Series 4, The Bearers of the Final Message. This week we're going to be looking at the theological schools in Islam and the theologians that founded them. We have to begin with the premise that if you think that human beings are rational, reasonable people, that they're capable of thinking and discussing things, then you have to accept that theology is going to be a necessary part of Islam, because we are thinking human beings, and therefore we're going to try and reason out and articulate what it is we believe. So trying to express what you believe is what we call theology. Trying to express it in different systems, in different philosophies, in different ways of speech, these are the jobs, these are the work of the theologians. So we're going to look at some of these theologians today. The first question that Muslims have to deal with is, God is all-powerful. If God is so all-powerful, how can I be responsible for my actions? Is it not that God actually compels me to do things? So there were some early Muslim theologians who said, life is like living out the script of a play. It's all written for you. You have no freedom. God compels you to do it in this way. Now, not surprisingly, other thinking people said, wait a minute, you can't do that, because then there's no human accountability. You can't blame me if it was all written for me in advance. So then we get the start of another school, and this school says that all human beings are totally free. Totally free, therefore we are totally responsible for all our actions. This means that I am accountable to God, and you can see by my life what kind of person I am. You can judge my faith according to the way that I live and act. Now, this is dangerous, because as soon as human beings start on the principle that they are capable of judging other human beings, not just God, then you get ultimate tribunals of human beings. So we had some people saying, we are capable of judging whether you believe or not. Whatever you say, we can judge by your actions. And if you say you do believe, but by your actions we can see that you don't, well, then you're a liar and a hypocrite. And what's more, some went as far as saying, we should execute you to stop you polluting the rest of the community. Now, the thing about theology is that there's nearly always a sort of give and take. There's one position is taken, and then another group comes along and takes an opposite position, or they pull back from the extreme positions. So then the majority said, wait a minute, you can't say that human beings can stand in ultimate judgment on other human beings, because that right is reserved for God alone, because only God knows the human heart. Now, there's an important hadith of the Prophet here, when he had sent off a group of men to chase off a raiding party, and when the leader came back, he said, make your report. And the leader said, well, we chased them, we fought them off, they left, and so on. And the leader then jumped down off his camel, threw himself on the floor, and made the shahada and said that he believed. But we knew he was a liar anyway, so we killed him. And the Prophet said to him, and before you judged this man to be a liar and killed him, did you take out his heart so that you could examine what was in it? Well, of course he couldn't. He didn't, because only God can judge the human heart. And therefore, the majority school of Islam, the vast majority, will say that the ultimate judgment is up to God. The human being cannot usurp the power of God in order to take that ultimate judgment on another human being. As soon as Greek philosophy started to enter into the Muslim community, and this was happening in places like Basra and Baghdad in the 8th, 9th century, then there's a challenge. How do you express your faith in these Greek philosophical terms? More than that, questions are being asked by the philosophers, and you have to think out new ways of answering them. So one of the people, the groups that was very much affected by this movement were called the Mu'tazilites. They were people who gave a great deal of emphasis to human reason, and sometimes therefore they were called the rationalists of Islam. Now the Mu'tazilites were very determined to keep the absolute oneness of God as the only eternal being. So anything that touched on that shaded into it, was not acceptable for them. So when the discussion came around to the status of the Quran, the Mu'tazilites said the Quran is a creation of God. It is a creature. It was created at a certain time in a certain place. Therefore, it is not eternal like God. Because if you say the Quran is eternal, then you can end up in a position of having two eternal beings, God and the Quran. So the Mu'tazilite position was to say that there is only God, everything else is a creation of God. And then they reacted very strongly against people who gave God any kind of human attribute. You see, there are verses in the Quran that talk about God seeing, about God sitting on the throne, about God's hands. Well, what does it mean then to say God has a hand or God has hands? The Mu'tazilites said these must be understood metaphorically. So the hand of God, this means the power of God, the grace of God. God is a spirit being. God does not have hands as we know them. We can't speak of God in this way. So they wanted to take out all human references when speaking about God. The next important point that the Mu'tazilites wanted to stress was the justice of God. God is just. God is truthful. God has said that wrongdoing will be punished. There will be judgment. God is just. Now, they gave a little story here by way of example. If there are two people, person A is tempted to commit a sin, gives in and sins. Person B is tempted to commit the same sin, but resists that temptation, struggles against it, and does not commit that sin. Now, if both of them appear before God on the day of judgment, and God is merciful to person A and lets them off the punishment for having committed that sins, well then the Mu'tazilites said God is being unjust to person B, because person B resisted that sin and struggled against it. This led them to say God must judge with justice. So God must judge and reward with justice according to the actions of people. This is problematic, of course, because then you have to say, well, what room is there then for the mercy of God if God must judge by justice? Another important principle of the Mu'tazilites was to say that only God can stand in ultimate judgment over someone. So our reason can tell us that these acts are wrong according to the guidance of God, according to the teaching of the Quran. And therefore we can expect, we can indeed predict, that if you die unrepentant, you will be punished for these actions. But only God knows whether the person is repentant or not. So therefore they step back from ultimate judgment on people, because God alone knows the heart of the repentant person or not. In the same way, when we have people who live a life of public sin, people who publicly are seen to be not living according to the teaching of the Quran, the Mu'tazilite position was to say, well, you cannot sit in judgment on them and say they're an unbeliever. At the same time, they confess that they believe, but you just don't know. So they took an intermediate position between these two extremes. And the final thing about the Mu'tazilites was to say that human beings must promote good on earth and must oppose evil. And they took this to the ultimate step of saying, therefore, it is a requirement that we should oppose an unjust ruler and cannot allow injustice to be put forward in this way, to be promoted within society. Now, the Mu'tazilite positions were influential in later schools of Islam, particularly within Shia schools of Islam. Amongst the Sunnis, the Mu'tazilites have some influence, they come and go. Mu'tazilites themselves are a very small group that continue on into the history of Islam. But they set a trend of thinking and of reasoning, and so we can see that later on lots of other groups actually are reacting to the positions that the Mu'tazilites took. Now remember the important position that a position provokes a reaction in another opposite direction. And so the reaction against the Mu'tazilites was led by Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And he said, reasoning is dangerous, theological speculation is dangerous. Stick therefore to what God says in the Quran and what the Prophet says of God. So these two pillars, the Quran and the Hadith, should be the basis for Islam. So for example, Ahmad ibn Hanbal said, when we speak or we hear in the Quran about God having hands, God has hands, but they are godlike hands and not human-like hands. So you have a more literal interpretation of the word of the Quran, and also you give particular emphasis to the early generations who focused on reporting the Hadith, the teachings of the Prophet. Another position that was taken between that of the Mu'tazilites and that of Ahmad ibn Hanbal was the major school of Sunni theology called the Al-Asharite school, Al-Ashari being its founder in the 10th century. Now, he takes an intermediate position. We have the Quran and the Sunnah, but we also have our reason, and he takes a more moderate use of reason. He says our human reason has limitations. There are things that God knows that our human reason cannot know, and therefore ultimately revelation must be obeyed even if our reason cannot demonstrate to us why it is right. So therefore we would not need revelation if our reason was capable of leading us to fully understand the ways of God. This led to a very important principle of Al-Ashari when he says, ask not how. Don't push it too far. There are things that you cannot know. Now we can see this principle of ask not how in relation to the Quran, because he says the Quran is not God, but is not other than God. Ask not how. So you can see that he is saying there are limits to human reasoning, and if you are not able to understand, you just submit to the revelation and ask not how this can be. Accept the limitations. In the same way, our human reason is not able to penetrate through to the justice of God. So it may be that God will ultimately send the pious person to hell and send the sinner to heaven. That is for God to decide in God's justice, and we're not able to penetrate through that far. There's a famous story told about Al-Ash'ari in conversation with one of his Mu'tazilite teachers. And it shows the way in which he regards the law of cause and effect of justice alone as being insufficient to take us into an understanding of Islam. And the scene goes like this. It's a scene in heaven, and a child is in heaven and notices that a man, an adult, has a higher place. And so the child asks God, why is it that that man has a higher place in heaven than I have? And God replies, because he did many good things in his life that you didn't do, and therefore he has a higher place. Well, the child says, but wait a minute, I died young. Why did you let me die young? I didn't have a chance to do all those good things and earn a higher place for myself. And God responds, well, I knew that if you lived a long time, you would do many evil things. Therefore, I was merciful and I killed you and let you die early, and therefore you've come to heaven. Well, at this, of course, there's a chorus of voices that come up from hell, of people saying, oh, but God, why didn't you let us die young before we were able to do all these bad deeds? So the law of cause and effect is not sufficient to explain the relationship of the human being and of divine justice. Another problem that Al-Ash'ari deals with is how can you hold the human being accountable for our actions given that God is all-powerful? And the way Al-Ash'ari dealt with this is to say God creates all actions. Everything exists by the will of God. So that I have the power to do something, that I do an act, is according to the will of God. We call this primary causation. However, how I do that act, that is secondary causation, and that responsibility is given to me. And so Al-Ash'ari says that the human being has the power to decide how an act is done by attribution. It's given to us by God immediately before we do the act, and therefore we are responsible and not God is responsible. Of course, God knows how I am going to use my power, how I'm going to act. So God knows the future, but God does not determine the future, so that God does not dictate how I will use the freedom that God gives me. Al-Ash'ari is the most influential of the Sunni schools of theology, but another school of theology within the Sunni tradition was established by Al-Maturidi, and he takes slightly different positions on several things. He has more room for the use of reason. So he says that our reason can take us through to actual knowledge about God, and therefore by our reason we are able to come to a judgment about human acts, for example. But at the same time, Al-Maturidi says that faith is judged by the confession of the person. If you say that you believe, then this confession is sufficient. Even if you are a bad person, you may be a bad Muslim, you may be a sinful Muslim, but you are still a Muslim because you confess that you are a Muslim. Now, this led him to say that the sinful person who is repentant of their sin will be awarded with paradise. Therefore, the repentant sinner will come to paradise. We're going to look now at two great theologians who try to reconcile different elements of knowledge within their systems, one within the Sunni system and one within the Shia system. And the task is to reconcile philosophy, theology, and also the mystical tradition. Now we're going to look at Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali very fortunately died in the year 1111, so he's easy to remember. And Al-Ghazali grew up and studied theology, and then he came to a realization that there were limits to philosophical thought. And so he used philosophical argument in order to demonstrate that the philosophers did not always penetrate through into the mind of God. We needed something more. We needed revelation. He then went further. He went through a kind of life crisis about 15 years before his death, when he realized that he had been struggling to become a great theologian rather than a great person of faith, a great knower and lover of God. And so he went through a period of his life in which he immersed himself in the mystical practices of Islam. And this led him then, in the last phase of his life, to try to revive the religious sciences, as he calls his famous book, so that he incorporates the theological, philosophical work with mystical experience, so that the human being needs to know not only rationally, but also to experience the relationship with God. A similar movement to that which was developed by Al-Ghazali took place also within the Shia schools of Islam in the 13th century, and here we can bring forward two names particularly who were hugely influential in this process. Al-Tusi, first of all, was a polymath. He was a great philosopher, a great scientist, a great mathematician, a great astrologer. And he brought philosophical thinking to bear in the development and the expression of Islamic faith in the Shia tradition. He's often thought of as being the reviver or the father of the philosophical school of Ibn Sina in the Eastern world. And so he brings this philosophical structure into developing and expressing the faith of Islam. One of his students was Al-Hilli. And Al-Hilli actually is regarded as the founding father of the Usuli school within the Shia tradition, which is the dominant school up to the present day. The Usul are the foundational principles of religious law, of theology, of the study of the Hadith. So he was a great systematizer who brought in the use of reason systematically to work out a methodology for Hadith development and criticism, for developing the principles of jurisprudence and of law, and his works in systematic theology, for example, are still textbooks up to the present time. The last of the theologians that I want to look at today is again coming from the 13th century, Ibn Taymiyyah, from the Sunni schools of thought. And Ibn Taymiyyah reacted against some of the earlier trends that we've seen. He reacted against philosophy and against Sufi mystical practice and thought. He also reacted against the use of reason without strict limits being placed upon it. And he also was opposed to the Shia schools of Islam. So Ibn Taymiyyah wanted to stress the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. This was the key foundation principle for Islam. And so he stressed the early generations of Islam who preserved the hadith and the teaching of the Prophet. And then he said that there should be a happy mean with reason, with revelation, with tradition, and with human free will. So these should all be under strict limitations. One of the key things about Ibn Taymiyyah was his stress on the need for political power. State and religion should be in a partnership, he said, and therefore in order to have Islam, Islam needed political power so that the state could pursue the good of the Islamic teaching and principles within society. So Ibn Taymiyyah is often thought of as being one of the influential thinkers behind some of those later developments that come within the Sunni tradition, which are looking at political Islam, those who say that we need an Islamic state in order to promote Islamic teaching within society. That concludes our roundup of the principal theologians and their schools. Join me again next week when we're going to be looking at Islam and other faiths. And just a reminder that you can download an article to go with this and every other talk by going to my own website. And if you've missed any of these programs, they are available to be screened and downloaded from the Ahl al-Bayt on-demand section of the website. I look forward to seeing you again.